everyone. People are still filtering in, so I'm going to wait just a minute or so before we get started. Yes, I am in my car. I apologize for that, but I promise this will be a wonderful event. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for attending our program, Constituting Community, a conversation with descendants of enslaved Americans. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Chu. I'm the interim president and CEO of Montpelier. For those of you who may not be familiar with Montpelier, it is the plantation of James Madison, the father of the US Constitution, author of the Bill of Rights, and fourth president, located in Orange County in central Virginia, about 90 miles from DC. The Montpelier staff have a long history of working with the descendants of the enslaved community at Montpelier and the surrounding region. We have, as of May of this year, formally embraced this partnership at the board level by achieving structural parity between the Montpelier Foundation Board and the Montpelier Descendants Committee, the democratic organization that represents those descended from enslaved people of the region. The conversation this evening, though, will focus on the descendant community and the legacy of those enslaved here and at neighboring plantations. This virtual panel is part of Montpelier's Constitution Month, which we've launched to commemorate the signing of the Constitution 235 years ago. You can join us all month long for on-site and virtual programming that explores the many facets of the Constitution. A critical piece of this includes descendant voices. For Constitution Month, Montpelier commemorates our founding document and the founders, including James Madison, as well as the invisible founders enslaved at Montpelier and surrounding plantations. This evening, our panelists will explore the history and legacy of the enslaved community at Montpelier and throughout the region. These stories and traditions passed down over generations speak not only to the history of Montpelier, but also to a national American narrative, making connections between past and present. Panelists will share how their ancestors helped shape America, the America we experience today. I am now going to briefly introduce each of our four panelists, and then we will begin with questions. Michael Carter Jr. is the 5th generation to farm at his family land and is an 11th generation American in the Orange County area. He works as a farmer and educator at his family farm, Carter Farms, and a climatrician with his nonprofit Africulture that promotes and espouses the principles, practices, plants, and people of African descent who have contributed and shaped agriculture. Moving on to Dr. Betty Kearse. Betty Kearse is a retired pediatrician, and according to 8 generations of her family's oral history, she's a descendant of President Madison and one of his enslaved cooks. Betty's research for her book, The Other Madisons, The Lost History of a President's Black Family, first brought her to Montpelier in 1992, and her research at the site continues today. She serves as a director on the board of the Montpelier Foundation and as a member of the Montpelier Descendants Committee. Patricia McDaniel is a native of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and is a 3rd great-granddaughter of Benjamin McDaniel, who was enslaved at Montpelier. Patricia is a lifelong genealogist and an attorney in Austin, Texas. Charisse Rothenbach is a medically retired Army vet, married to an Army captain, and a brand new mother. She's a descendant of the Ellis family line. She is currently working on finishing her law degree and aspires to work hand in hand with the ACLU before establishing a political career. So I'm very excited to get started with this wonderful panel. We will be talking for about 40 or 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions. So please put your questions in the chat and we will answer them towards the end of the program. So here is the first question for the panel. As I briefly touched on at the start, Enslaved Americans are the unrecognized and unacknowledged founders of America. However, when we talk about the writing of the Constitution, the conversation, whether in the classroom or at cultural sites like Montpelier, often centers on Madison. Why is it important that enslaved Americans be recognized as critical actors in the founding of our country? And I'll let whoever would like to jump in first, just jump in.
Well, I will start. Oh, go ahead, Michael.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you again for having us and being able to share this important information. And I want to, before I even say anything, just kind of acknowledge the spirit of our ancestors and those shoulders upon which we stand and by which we're still here speaking and espousing their greatness and their contributions to the society and sacrifices today. I think the biggest reality of why Madison is pushed out in the forefront is that President Madison was a figurehead of a larger institution. Most figureheads are usually the ones that's put out in the forefront. Those who work at Amazon are not necessarily known as well as Jeff Bezos. And it was the same type of situation with Montpelier. But the reality as well becomes how we perceive what's now termed as enslaved people and what we call slaves and how we learned it as being slaves. Slaves is such a grossly blanketed term. And that blanketed term usually espouses or covers about 35 to 115 different occupations on a plantation. So in that respect, it's tough to see where you fit in if you only see slave as somebody who did not get paid for the work that they did. Slavery was 100% taxed on the thoughts, the labor, and the bodies of enslaved Africans. And not a lot of context is given into the other contributions of being engineers, of being chefs, of being caretakers, of being agriculturalists, of being bricklayers, of being blacksmiths, of being psychologists, of doctors, of nurses, of it being inventors. And how we perceive that becomes why a lot of us don't really interact with this type of history. Because when you refer to strictly as slaves, even as descendants of the enslaved, the perception of the slave or the enslaved is very low amongst all people. And we don't really go into depth about what they actually contributed to the larger society. So that becomes, why it's important and why we're having this conversation now is to really share the in-depth nature of those individuals who gave everything for the freedom that some could share and have in 1788, 1789.
Well, Michael, embedded in your comments is that without all those people doing all that work in all those different areas of the daily lives of Madison and his family on the plantation, Madison would not have had the luxury to go off to Princeton to learn the basics of political theory. He would not have had the luxury of sitting on the second floor of the main house to kind of mull over and try to structure some of those ideas. He would have had to do some real work, if you'll forgive that term. And, and when he went off to Princeton, when he went to Philadelphia to the convention, he took an enslaved man with him. So they were right there in every aspect of his life, and he could not have been the person that he was. He would not have been able to make the contributions that he did.
And we also have to recognize that President Madison had kind of a different political philosophy for the nation than he did for his own home. these broad principles of freedom and self-destiny and, all of that were still influenced by, the broader philosophies of the day with other slave holding founders, as well as a few non-slave holding founders. And it seems to me that they, including Madison, had these broad ideas, these big ideas, but they were benefiting so much from what was going on at home. And we're talking at Montpelier, hundreds of people were enslaved, that they couldn't set that aside because for one reason or another, either it was convenient or it was the standard of the environment. But it's kind of a paradox that we have, this wonderful document, as flawed as it might be, but underneath all of that, we have our ancestors holding it up.
As a little, I guess you say, caveat to what Pat just said, which I totally agree with as far as the Constitution having so many integral parts that allowed us to become what we are today, although we were not in mind when that document was created. Many years down the road, they decided to add the amendments that gave us the privileges that we have today, such as if I'm not mistaken, Pat, you were also in the military? So, for us to be able to serve, the country that, at one time looked down upon us and, treated us a certain way. So, I mean, although it has its history and not being for us, it eventually has molded and morphed into something that is for us.
Well, and both you and I, Sharice, have served in the military, and I know that African Americans have served all throughout and have died for this country, have died for the Constitution. And, we've all taken, those of us who have served, we've taken an oath to defend the Constitution. So we take this very seriously. And, if you ask any veteran, they'll say, this is African American descent. This is my country. I built this country. Absolutely. And we are dedicated to keeping it alive.
And I think as well, the aspect of the importance of those individuals being there is that, right now equity is a big buzzword, but equity for many of us means that you have a part in something. If you have equity in a home, that means you have a value in that home. And at some point, you may want to cash out that value. And I think recognizing the original founding fathers as not just Jefferson and Madison and Monroe and others, but establishing those enslaved individuals, those people who made all of the things happen that would happen, that it would not necessarily be a country without them here. Recognizing them shows a certain level of equity that as people of African descent, we deserve, and we have a part and stake in this country. I think presently, I know for my family, and especially for myself, I drove by Montpelier all the time with no desire to ever go in there because I never saw me in there. I never saw my stake in there. No matter, and my family necessarily didn't talk about our role or lack thereof. It was just not a place for us. And I think now we're starting to see our roles and our places, and recognizing our ancestors allows us to see and want to make a visit, want to learn more about what happened there on a day-to-day basis, because now we can see us in it. We can see our equity in it.
One of the things that visitors to Montpelier really resonate with is looking really closely at the sides of the house, of the bricks. And because the bricks were made by enslaved women and children, you can see fingerprints still to this day in the bricks. And what could be more just redolent of who actually built it than the fingerprints, the hands that made the bricks and laid the bricks are visible today. I think it's really important for people to acknowledge. So let's move on to another question. This is about the slave trade in connection to place. The history of slavery in America is one of movement, both forced and voluntary. People were kidnapped in Africa and enslaved. Once in the US, those men, women, and children were sold. Often people were sold more than once in their lifetimes, or they had loved ones who were sold. Some self-emancipated. Others gained freedom with the passage of the 13th Amendment and left the plantations in which they were once enslaved. You are all descendants from the plantation community in this region of Virginia. Some of you live in the state, some of you don't. What do you know about your family ties to the region, and where do you call home now? How was this movement, or lack thereof, influenced by slavery and or its abolition?
I can speak for myself. My ties to Orange County would be my grandmother, Clara Ellis Bailey Payne. But we were there from, I guess you'd say James Madison first initially getting there with Suki or Susan. She was with Dolly. She was Dolly's right hand. Did her hair, cooked breakfast, and things of that nature. But I currently live in Colorado, but my husband's still active duty, so we move around a lot. But I was getting ready to call her Nana. That's my grandmother. That was what we called her. She gave me tons of information as far as how we were connected. We actually had a plot of land that had the Ellis, it was the Ellis Cemetery pretty much, of many people buried there on this property, where it was given to us actually by the Madisons. And I remember being there, and there was no electricity, and having to go to the bathroom in pots and pumping water out to get some water. There was no electricity at all, and trying to be a child and make that area fun was a little difficult growing up in the world of technology. But that connection, that piece of history is just amazing to know that all of these people actually lived and breathed and farmed that land and cut the grass. And, you know, as Michael was talking about with the agriculture, that was the land that they had, that they used to its, and it's still used today. I can't even say it's extinction, because they still use that land, still farm that land. But that's my connection to Orange County.
And Sharice, I'm sorry, go ahead. Ms. McDaniel, go ahead.
I was going to say my connection is from Benjamin McDaniel, who was enslaved at Montpelier from probably maybe even birth in the late 1790s. And he ended up being sold by Dolly to pay her bills. He was enslaved for at least 50 years, I believe. And, you know, the stories that were passed down from my dad would tell stories about Benjamin. He was a liveryman, he was a cobbler, and I guess he was one of the literate folks enslaved that was enslaved there. I don't know how he became literate, but in my research from genealogy, I found out that he had filed a grievance with the Freedmen's Bureau. So I was able to find out a lot more about him over the years than my father actually knew. But my connection with Orange is only that family oral history that we learned about Benjamin's child and grandchild and even great-grandchild all lived in Orange. And then my grandfather ended up moving to Pittsburgh to get a job. So I hadn't been back for until the early 2000s.
And my connection goes back a long time. My family, a portion of my family, or the last of my family, first arrived in this area in 1745, or the last portion of it arrived in 1745 from Scotland. And they were people of African descent out of Scotland who revolted against the king and were sent away as indentured servants. My family history, the Shirley side of my family goes back to as far as 1622 with the first plantation in America, the Shirley Plantation in Charles City, Virginia. And I don't know if we were originally here or we were part of the Angolans that would have possibly came here during that time period. My ancestral history traces back to Angola, and at least from my paternal side. I was amused by Charisse because I think that connection that she just mentioned, which you probably didn't realize she mentioned, but she called her Nana or Nana within the Ghanaian tree of Khan culture. That's what you call an elder or a chief or a queen mother or your grandparents, Nana. And many of us had Nanas. And that was always our connection back to our origins, that we could always call a Nana. I had a Nana just like you had a Nana, Charisse. You know, and we always had those little nuances to make that connection. And I think we have another connection in terms of just, we're both from the Ellis tree. I'm not sure how large that branch is, but my great grandfather to the sixth power, Robert Ellis, started a community in Orange County in a place called Lahore, called Freetown. And that was started in 1860. And it's believed to be that the person who gave him the land of 18 acres was the carriage driver of Dolly Madison. And from there, you know, my family was able to acquire more land in Orange County. We have 150 acres approximately off of Tatum Road and Carter Farms. My other side of the family, my great-grandfather's side as well, Jefferson Davis and Catherine Shirley also acquired land on Shirley Road, which is off of Tatum Road, as well as off of 522. So our roots again run deep as landowners, as well as free Blacks, free African Americans here. Our McIntyre side was a lot of free African Americans that were living here. So we were greatly influenced by both slavery and its abolition, because we had to kind of straddle the fence quite a bit.
I'm an Ellis too, Michael. My
Hey, cousin.
Benjamin was married to Frances Ellis. So
My family history is remarkably similar to Pat McDaniel's in that Dolly Madison sold our great-great-great-grandfathers. So Pat's great-great-grandfather was sold because Dolly needed money. My great-great-grandfather was sold because Dolly was angry with him. And so he was just dispensable. And he ended up in Texas, first to Tennessee and then in Texas. But when he was sold, his mother, who was the cook that had the relationship with James Madison Jr., pleaded with my great-great-grandfather to always remember that he was a Madison, because she thought that the name could help them find each other again someday. However, they never did find each other, and they were never reunited. But over the generations, that plea became a source of family pride and inspiration. So it began as always remember you're a Madison, but today it is always remember you're a Madison. You descend from African slaves and a president. And my ancestors who ended up in Texas really took that credo to heart. So my great uncle Henry was a member of the 1868 Constitutional Convention and a captain of the all-Black unit of the 6th Regiment of the Texas State Guard. I make sure I got the wording right. So, you know, he was right there making contributions, knowing that he was important, that he had something to contribute. My own great-grandfather sort of became, what do you call it when you flip property? So he bought 400 acres and then made a little money on that and then bought 800 acres. So that's his contribution to sort of, what do you call it, sort of an economic tradition, really, today. But it's the pride that they had in themselves that is really their primary contribution to other African Americans and to this country at large.
Thanks, everyone. The next question also relates to sense of place. And this question is, when did you first come to Montpelier and how did it affect you?
Can I do that one? I first came in 1992 when I was doing research for my book. And the moment I set foot, so I took this little shuttle. At that time, there was a small visitor center that was on the other side of Route 20, and you had to take a shuttle onto the actual grounds. And the moment I stepped foot off that shuttle and felt my feet on that ground where my ancestors had walked some 200 years earlier, I really felt like I belonged there. And as I kind of spent some time there and met people and explored what was there, I developed really a just tremendous mixture of emotions. So there was the closeness I felt to my ancestors, especially my enslaved ancestors. There was the pride in their ability to hold on to their sense of their humanity when they were considered property. They never felt that they were property. There was pain too in knowing that my great-great-grandfather was sold and that his mother had been raped, and as was her mother. So there was pain in that as well. And it was really a hard experience to be there, but it was a period of tremendous growth. And so I still come. I come as often as I can. And I do today feel very much a part of Montpelier and its history.
I visited Montpelier back in 2017 with my Nana, my father, and my youngest sister. And walking through the house, let me just start by saying that, walking through the house and just, I guess you would say, like replaying it in your mind, almost trying to live as though they lived back then and walking in the footsteps of those, I guess, the elders, the ancestors that I've come from, and just seeing what they saw, so to speak. And just looking at the things that they touched, like you could see hairbrushes and things of that nature, and the bed that people slept in. And it's just, it can be overwhelming at times, because especially when you go outside to the slave quarters and you see where they were, where they slept, where they worked. You look at the tobacco fields and you just see, you can not say that you can actually see, but you can feel it in your spirit the things that they went through. So like you can imagine how intense things were. Just being alive in that time, the things that they didn't have, things that they were deprived of, like basic human necessities that we, take for granted every day, just little things that they may not have had or experienced. And even just, thinking about the things that were donated by my grandmother and looking at them, and you can really like almost reach out and touch, like, oh my gosh, someone held this in their hand from way back when, and I'm related to them, or just things of that. It was amazing when I went, pretty much, and just seeing things, the last bowl that they held, or the last time somebody actually touched this was in the 1800s, or the last time this person picked this up was in the 1700s. It's just amazing to be able to reach out and actually touch a piece of history.
Yeah. And I guess my story, my first time coming to Montpelier was Saturday. So I'm a recent visitor, and I didn't get a chance to take a tour of the entire grounds. It was a very specific side of the property we went to. But I went with my three sons, and in going with them, I feel good that I'm exposing them to something I have never been exposed to in this area. I've been to numerous slave dungeons within West Africa. I've been to various plantations throughout Virginia and probably throughout the East Coast or southern United States, but never to Montpelier. And I'm gonna say a feeling of relief, but definitely a feeling of I'm anxious to tell my ancestral stories, and not just the ones that resided there, but the ones that just contributed to the economy of this area, and being able to give them another sense of dignity and honor. So in that respect, I'm excited. I'm looking forward to sharing and really exploring how we can lift them up as much as possible.
I went to Montpelier for the first time in 2007. They were reaching out to slave descendants to do I think that things were getting started to work with the descendants as a more of a formal nature rather than ad hoc that had gone on before. And so there was an event planned, and we did DNA testing and all that. And the main house was still under construction, well, under repair. And so there wasn't furniture or anything like that. And they had not built up any of the areas where the enslaved had been. But I think my sense of being there was just that it was sad. It was sad to me because I thought, there's so many people who were enslaved here that, as Elizabeth, when you started off, you said that the invisible founders that have become invisible because people didn't keep records. And so the names have been lost, and what people did, that's been lost. So there's just, to me, it was very nice to be there and be a part of this working together. But I just felt sad about the humanity of all of those people who worked there, that no records were kept of or anything like that. And I talked to they asked people to give their stories and tell the oral histories and that kind of thing. And so I mentioned my ancestor, Benjamin, and it was we were filling in. And it was a good thing that we had these oral histories, because we were filling in, that so many people have lost that throughout the generations. That to me, this experience now and going back is trying to rehumanize the folks who actually worked there and that were kind of just forgotten for a long time.
Thanks, everyone. The next question is also about connections to the ancestors. How have your parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents carried on your ancestors' legacy and shared that with future generations? And how do you plan to do that for your posterity?
Well, I mentioned the oral history, and I think that that was what came down to us. And same with Betty, as she was able to relate. That's how we got these stories. And you know, I'm a genealogist, so I was able to fill in the stories, but the importance of the stories coming to us from our ancestors and the way that they were able to humanize people who had been forgotten, to me, is very important.
My family also has a strong tradition of oral history. Following the ancient West African griot tradition, they were oral historians going back, you know, thousands of years in Africa, and it is a tradition that survived the Middle Passage and is growing stronger and stronger, I believe, among African American families. In my family, we have been very careful to assign one person in each generation to be kind of responsible for the stories and any artifacts that, you know, we might have. And that person tells the story to the next generation, chooses someone in the next generation to be responsible for the stories and the artifacts. And in turn, it goes on and on. So I'm the 8th generation griot in my family. My daughter will be the 9th. One of my grandchildren will be the 10th, and on and on.
And I found, I guess, my family history or my family's contribution to maintaining it was first acquiring land with Freetown in Lahore, Virginia, Lahore, Orange. And then my great-great-grandparents purchasing property throughout Orange to sustain the family. So our family farm is 112 years old this year. And I still maintain and run that. My great-grandmother, we call her Gran, was a tremendous, I think, family historian. She worked with Howard University genealogists to help unravel a lot of our family history, a lot of it. And I've kind of definitely taken on that respect. My great-grandmother Lucille was an outstanding cook. And I think some of those food traditions also been maintained by our grandmothers and our grandfathers and our mothers and fathers. They usually get, I don't know, sometimes they get overshadowed by how good the cooks were in this area. I've heard quite a bit, and Sister Edna Lewis, who's a world-renowned, phenomenal chef, grew up as a cousin of ours. And, you know, every time we asked the elders about her, they said she wasn't even the best cook around because she just happened to go to New York and get exposure. And just talking to one of my cousins last week about it, cousin Charles, he was saying that no matter what, the mothers were always the better cooks than the daughters. Always giving respect and honor to those mothers who taught those daughters how to cook. And those are some of the traditions that we do with Carter Farms and in Africulture. We do various workshops and festivals, and hope to show those experiences. My father was an agriculture teacher. My uncle's an agriculture teacher. So we've maintained this agricultural legacy for at least the last 11 generations in America. And I've passed it on to my sons who have carterbrothers.net. Shameless plug, you can go buy some seeds. But they have a seed company in which they are selling African seeds, African plant seeds. So we find ourselves enveloping ourselves and our culture and our community to make sure we pass it on to the next generation?
Speaking from personal experience, I know for myself, I'm not by no means calling anyone on this panel old. I want to say that for my age, I wasn't for a very long time. Like I had a little interest in history, but not to the magnitude of my grandmother's interest and the things that she did and the amounts of things that she donated to different institutions. I would like to say though, upon her passing in 2019, I did actually start looking more in depth into the things that she contributed to different institutions. As far, she even contributed some artifacts to Yale University, which I just found out. A few boats and things that were actually used, not boats, but like the rowboats that were used, not for escaping, but a few of the rowboats that were used for leisure activities, I'll say. But I just, as time has progressed and, I'm starting to pick up some of the things that, she left behind and just reviewing some of the documents and things of that nature, I'm starting to see a broader picture of the different contributions that the family did have and the things that they left behind for us to try to continue. I know this may sound a little morbid, what have you, but on her deathbed, I made a promise to her to actually continue with her work and continue researching and finding new things and just trying to advance as much as I can what she did find and discover. Like in my introduction, I am a new mother, and I will bestow upon my son the different things that my family has contributed to society. This lineage is such of great importance that I want him to know where he came from and just be proud of who he is in this line of great people who contributed to the overwhelming contributions to America.
Thank you. I have one more question for the whole panel, and then we'll move on to audience questions. And you've already touched on this a little bit. How do you all see the younger generation carrying on the work of sharing their family stories? How can we motivate them to care about their history and their ancestors?
I think Betty has the right answer. I think every generation has to at least have one person that is the person to carry on, to ensure that they know the stories, they have the artifacts. And it just seems to me that, at least in my family, that has happened, that there's that one person that takes it upon themselves or is put on them to pass down the stories. I was lucky that my father and one of his brothers, they both took that on, and because it was a big family, they were able to put that out there to everyone. But even now, people, my cousins and cousins' kids, they'll come, if there's a question, they'll come to me to ask, what's the story here? And so I think it's very important that we ensure that somebody in that next generation can carry that torch.
Yeah, and involve the children early on. Tell them the stories, have them record the stories. I wish I had done more of that, because hearing the stories in those voices really brings them alive and makes them more fascinating. So that's one thing the kids can do. They can be sent on treasure hunts. We all have pictures and boxes and just stuff. It might be buttons in some box in the closet or an attic. And I think children would find it really rewarding and feeling like they were making a contribution themselves if they discovered, some of those family treasures and adding them to the box. In my case, it's one box where everything is, but they would feel part of that if they found a picture or a doll that someone had in the previous generation, an army insignia, anything at all, because that item, whatever it is, was touched by an ancestor. Makes it real.
And I've started the process with my children. Like I said, my first trip to Montpelier was this past Saturday. My children joined me. And my youngest son, who's 7, once, probably about 30 minutes into the hike or journey, he began leading the pack like he had been there before. And it was inspiring to see, because this little, 3.5 foot little young man was, walking up hills. We were there for 3 hours walking through the thick of the bush. He wasn't complaining about anything. He was looking to get rid of the spider webs for everybody else. And he took that on as his charge to try to collect as many spider webs as possible. He missed a lot because I caught a lot with my face, but it was still those type of energies. My other son, my 10-year-old, was in the creek, while Mr. Reeves was speaking and talking about this, and Mr. French was talking. My son was in the creek. I don't know if he's looking for minnows but allowing children to be children in those environments where they can actually, make it their own experience. I think many times adults sometimes can be overbearing in terms of how we want them to perceive that experience. Allow them to make it their own experience. As we were leaving, my second oldest son, we did some videoing to prepare for his TikTok and social media presence about how he felt about these particular buildings. So I think, including them in a manner in which they can relate, whether it be social media, whether it be, Reels or TikToks or YouTube stories, Instagram stories, et cetera, but allowing them to engage it where they feel most comfortable at is the best way to keep the children involved. And I love the idea of a treasure hunt. I mean, we have the Amazing Race, and I'm probably gonna talk to Mr. James about that later on, about how you can do a nice little, a historical pursuit of sorts.
Audience member question: do you encounter denial, pushback, or anger when you speak with other people about your family's history? If so, what form does that take? How do you handle it? And what do you make of it in the general context of, I guess, the different ways Americans seem to view U.S. history, particularly the history of slavery?
I've never received any pushback on my history. It's like, I don't know how you could actually do that, to be honest. I mean, if it's your history, it's yours. Now, how you feel about it is how you feel about it. But I speak about my family and my family's history and their role in this environment quite a bit. So, I guess from the common thread, I think it's an understanding, or at least a common thread of the realities of the plantation system and the realities of our involvement in terms of how we've intertwined in American society. So we are part of almost every aspect of American society. And unfortunately, or unfortunately, we have these scenarios where you have mulatto children, you have octoroon children, you have laws specifically created that if you were born to a Black woman, you will be enslaved. You're born to a white person, you may be a white woman, you would probably be an indentured servant. So, I grew up in the area where Miss Mildred Loving lived. I went to school with her grandson. And these are laws that were on the books until last year, misogyny laws and things like that. So I think, for me anyway, I've never had any pushback from my family and refuse in dealing with that aspect of morality. It's been more so, people are much more inquisitive, especially in this day and time for me.
I can I can personally attest to pushback and some interesting commentary towards my family history when I've expressed it. This sounds really bad. I am actually I'm in an interracial marriage, and I've experienced a lot of commentary, if you will, from certain portions of the family in regards to me actually being a descendant from that lineage, not being given the not respect or anything of that nature, but the acknowledgement that these things have actually happened. A lot of it is downplayed as far as the roles go, but the response that I typically give is one of information, because that's really all that you can do, is provide information so that they can process it how they will, but you won't be maybe seen in a different light, but you just give them the information to process and they do with it as they will, because that's all you can do nowadays, is just tell people your story. Whether they choose to believe it or not is up to them. But as Michael said, you can't really deny who you are and what you are and where you've come from. It's history, it's facts, it is what it is.
Well, and it's our story, like Michael said, it's our story. And as far as people's reaction to our story, for me personally, most people that I tell my story, they're surprised that when I say I'm descended from enslaved people. And I actually am descended from enslaved people on both sides of my family. My mother's family were enslaved in Virginia, which is now part of West Virginia, up by Charlestown. But most people, to me, they're surprised by that. And as Michael was saying, you know, the nature of slavery was such that there were white owners having children with enslaved people over and over and over. You kind of build up your crop, so to speak, to make money. And you would have, you know, this is a way to do that. And so people like me that look like me, there are lots of people out there that are descended from enslaved people. And as far as people's reaction to that, if they can't accept that, then that's really on them.
Well, I certainly get a lot of pushback. And I think it's a lot of it is because they want Madison's image protected. So my family oral history is that I descend from an enslaved cook and President James Madison. And so some people, for example, those who are members of the National Society of Madison Family Descendants, I believe that's the title of it. Some of those have pushed back, no, because you're Black, you can't be, and you got to prove it. But there are others who embrace me and call me a cousin, because it's a rather common history throughout the South. And it's the story that I've known throughout my life, and my mother, my grandfather, going back 8 generations. So it's like Michael says, you can't deny someone else's history. It's like Pat said, it was a common, though I don't accept the term that it was sort of a standard of the time. It was common. And so there are those people who accept history, accept the facts of history. Tends to be the younger generations who are more open.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'll be taking over for Elizabeth. And we've got a lot of questions in the chat, but There's a few more I want to get to, at least one. So panelists, what advice would you give to parents who are not comfortable and or supportive of discussing the issues of slavery with their children who are in K through 12 schooling?
What advice? I don't know how to say that politically correctly. But the reality is what you hold from them is why we have the situation we have now. Because this discussion wasn't had in the 1780s, in the 1800s, in the 1860s, in the 1880s, in the 1910s and 1920s, 1960s, in the 1990s. We keep having to repeat the same history over and over again because we fail to have a proper conversation on it. If Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois can say the greatest problem of the 20th century would be the race problem, and we can say with confidence again, the greatest problem of the 21st century is still the race problem. It's because we haven't adequately addressed it. And we haven't adequately addressed it because individuals aren't necessarily comfortable with being uncomfortable. And until you can grow up to understand that discomfort makes you stronger, makes you better, you know, I'm sure we can give stories of ancestors who had to do things that were very uncomfortable, who gave up their freedom so that you could have a K-12 education. And if you do not give respect to those individuals, you're going to be doomed to repeat these things over and over and over again. This is not critical race theory. This is American history. And this is a filtered freedom that you're giving yourself. And you're giving yourself this kind of, you're doing your children and yourself a disservice by not learning the vastness, the broadness, the in-depthness of American history.
Well, I just agree with Michael completely. Being ignorant is not going to help young people grow, understand themselves in the context of this country and its history. You know, I feel like I could say more about that, but it's really hard to express how strongly I feel that denying truth is sort of like not dealing with it is a self-protection that's going to be an effort at self-protection is going to be more harmful in the long run. In part is being shown now by what Michael stated. I mean, I think this country needs to express or address rather the pain of its past.
I'm going to add one more comment. And it's like, you know, many of us have, you know people who have had health challenges. And if you give a person sugar and you know they have diabetes, or give them a lot of salt and you know they have high blood pressure, you realize that they're going to eventually, you know, have some issues. But what we fail to do is look at where the source is. And because we have not looked at where the source is of this issue with us, because we refuse to deal with where the source is of high blood pressure or diabetes, we end up getting sick or making ourselves sick because we never deal with the source. And if historically, if we don't deal with this source in any clear way, we're going to repeat some nasty parts of our history. Nastier parts than even, I won't say nasty, equivalent parts to the nastier parts of our history, and returns to rebellion, returns to how we treat one another. And to make this country truly great, it's going to require us to learn more about our history and the complicated original sin, as Madison called it. And then for most of us who go to church, with original sin, you don't keep sinning. The first thing you got to do is acknowledge it, then repent, and then figure out how to fix it. And I think, this being, majority of Christian individuals, we've got to really call on our spiritual, our Christian, our religious values about how would you want to be treated if someone had an original sin against you.
Well, and the other thing is that I think Madison and the rest of the founders, they knew that slavery was going to be an issue down the road. They knew that, and they thought, or at least some of them thought, and I think probably President Madison was one of these people, they thought that a future generation is going to deal with that. And that future generation is going to make it better. But what happened was we had Civil War, we had Reconstruction, and then we had Jim Crow. And so you can't just think the future generation is going to make it better. The future generation might actually destroy our democracy. So it is so important. I mean, I'm a strong believer in education, but it is important to have a full education. There's no reason to have half truths or paper over the truth. We need to tell the full story and make this country a better country. But as I said earlier, people have fought and died for this country, for the Constitution, and I'm sorry, I muted. Education's a foundation for that.
That we're coming up on the hour. We're just a couple minutes past. And I want to thank all the panelists for your time, but also for sharing your stories with everyone this evening. So thank you all. And thank everyone. I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening for this panel. And just to let you know, we do have a number of upcoming programs as part of Montpelier's Constitution Month, including 2 more virtual panels in addition to this one. So you can join us on September 22nd at 7 p.m. for the panel called Striving for Freedom, How Black Americans Shaped Our Democracy. And we'll have Dr. Hassan Jeffries and Dr. Leslie Alexander, who will be talking about how people of African descent laid the foundation for American democracy. We also have another virtual panel on the evening of September 29th, which is called Getting Organized, How to Help Create Inclusive Communities. And that panel explores how local organizers shape their communities through things like civic engagement, exhibition of art, cultural resource management. So those 2 panels are going to be really engaging, and they're available for all members of the public, free to the public. And if you are in the area or if you're looking to take a trip, Montpelier is offering Constitution Day on Saturday, September 17th. And that day we'll have a series of on-site panels, which will also be live streamed, so you can join us virtually as well. And those panels will look at the state of our democracy, potential threats to our freedom as Americans, and we'll also look at kind of the new governance structure at Montpelier. Visitors on site that day can also take advantage of specialty tours, activity booths, and interactive discussions with Mr. Madison himself. So please join us on site that day if you can. And if you have questions that were not answered this evening, we will reach out to you with answers to those questions. And if you have questions that you did not ask, please feel free to send those to Emily, who is our manager of student and family programs. She'll be emailing you all this recording, so you can just kind of follow up with her and ask any of those questions. So we just want to thank you again for joining us this evening, and stay tuned for more Constitution programming. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you again, panelists, for being here with us this evening.